When you hear that line, you might be struck by its radical implication, that the monopoly of force, long regarded as the essence of sovereignty, is in retreat. Yet, that is exactly the world we live in today. Private military and security companies, PMSCs, more commonly called private military companies, PMCs, now offer warfighting and security as a service. They recruit fighters, train armies, guard convoys, protect infrastructure, offer intelligence support. In the last 2 decades, they've become inseparable from modern conflict. Consider this fact. Over the past 20 years, the growth of PMSCs has been staggering. The 2023 SIPRI yearbook documents how these firms now operate across nearly every continent, providing services formerly reserved for national militaries. They fill gaps in state capacity, operate in weak states or conflict zones, and frequently take on roles as frontline actors. The United States, United Kingdom, China, and South Africa are estimated to host roughly 70% of the industry's firms. The term mercenary, traditionally loaded with moral judgment, no longer suffices to describe this new genus of force. As Sean McFate, a former U.S. Army paratrooper turned scholar, frames it, mercenaries are more powerful than experts realize when profitability is everything. These are a wholly different genus than national armies. The transition is not accidental. In the post-Cold War era, many governments downsized conventional forces, outsourcing security as a cost-saving gamble. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. relied heavily on contractors to handle logistics, base security, and even strike missions. That huge demand created a global marketplace for force. As McFate notes, some argue that states legitimize mercenaries by hiring them, a claim he strongly rejects, saying the nature of mercenary force does not change by association. Yet with rise comes contestation. Critics question accountability, legality, motive, and long-term consequences. Why should war be reduced to commercial contracts? What happens when profit overrides principle? These are the tensions that define this new face of war. The story of modern PMCs begins in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when war-torn Africa became the proving ground. One of the most cited pioneers is Executive Outcomes, EO. Founded by South African soldier Eben Barlow, EO offered full military solutions, infantry, air support, logistical networks, to states like Sierra Leone and Angola. They turned battlefield defeats into commercial wins, making profit from kinetic effect rather than ideology. Their friendly force package model became a blueprint. Other episodes cemented the transformation. In 1997, the Sandline affair in Papua New Guinea erupted when the government contracted mercenaries to suppress a rebellion. The public backlash and constitutional crisis forced the government to reverse course, yet the precedent remained. Sovereign violence could be outsourced. From there, the path was set. Firms grew, layered in services from security to advisory to strike capacity. Companies like Blackwater, now Academy, and DynCorp in the U.S. expanded aggressively during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Capitalizing on new demand, they brought professionalism, infrastructure, global networks, and secrecy. Soon, a new paradigm emerged: war as a modular service. A state could now buy airlift, reconnaissance, force protection, or target elimination. Pick and pay. That modularity is a core structural shift in how force is organized in the 21st century. Behind every PMC is a contract, something written in fine print, negotiated in corridors of power. These contracts structure everything: scope, rules of engagement, accountability, oversight, remuneration. In many cases, states prefer contractors because they permit flexibility, deniability, and off-budget deployment. Consider the notion of force multiplication by proxy, a small core team hired to orchestrate larger local elements, using contracts to scale effect, or plausible deniability, where states can claim non-involvement, while reaping the strategic benefit of kinetic action. But cost efficiency claims mask hidden risks. Contractors may extend conflict, since longer engagements mean longer incomes. Perverse incentives crop up. Do you negotiate peace or sustain war? Corruption, duplicitous subcontracting, and lack of oversight are endemic. As the European Council's 2022 Business of War report notes, Wagner's operations, for example, frequently involve murky resource deals and questionable state contracts. In essence, PMCs are businesses embedded in conflict zones. They bid, they deliver, and they profit. But the currency is death, displacement, and political fragmentation, and their salary. Inside a private military company, pay varies dramatically depending on role, experience, nationality, and the level of personal risk involved. But overall, the industry's pay scale reflects a hierarchy that blends military structure with corporate economics. Support roles, cooks, cleaners, interpreters, and base maintenance staff, often come from local populations or third country nationals, TCNs, employed through subcontractors. Their pay can be as low as $500 to $1,500 per month, despite living under the same mortar fire and conditions as the rest of the personnel. Then there are the logistical and technical specialists, medics, drivers, mechanics, communications officers, and intelligence analysts. Their pay falls in the mid-range, typically $5,000 to $10,000 per month, depending on skill level and proximity to combat. Paramedics with combat trauma experience are especially valued and can command near-operator pay. The bulk of the workforce consists of contractors or operators, the rifle-carrying security specialists. They're the backbone of the company, recruited for tactical skills and adaptability. A Western X Special Forces operator might earn between $8,000 and $15,000 per month tax-free during deployments, while local hires or contractors from countries with lower wage expectations, such as Eastern Europe, Latin America, or parts of Africa, might make $2,000 to $5,000 for similar risks. This wage disparity often mirrors global inequalities, and within compounds, it can foster quiet resentment between multinational teams. Above them are the team leaders and operations managers who coordinate missions on the ground, convoy protection, embassy security, or training local forces. These are seasoned veterans, usually with at least a decade in special operations or law enforcement. Their pay typically ranges from $12,000 to $20,000 per month, depending on deployment risk and contract terms. Those operating in active combat zones like Iraq or Afghanistan during the 2000s often commanded the higher end of that scale. At the top are executive management and project directors, often former colonels or special operations officers who transition into oversight and client relations. They can earn anywhere from $250,000 to $500,000 per year. Sometimes they hold equity in the firm or manage multiple contracts in volatile regions. Their role is less about combat and more about strategy, logistics, and maintaining relationships with government or corporate clients, oil companies, NGOs, or even defense ministries. Pay also scales with risk, rotation length, and nationality. American or British contractors tend to earn more due to higher insurance costs and corporate standards, while Eastern European or African contractors are often hired on cheaper, short-term deals. Hazard bonuses, imminent danger pay, and completion bonuses can add thousands to a contract, but death or injury compensation, the so-called blood money, varies wildly between companies. In the end, a PMC operates like a business. Risk and skill are commodities with price tags. A few make fortunes. Most make solid middle-class wages for extraordinary danger. What is life like inside a PMC on the ground? These are not the romantic mercenaries of old, swaggering soldiers of fortune in dusty berets and mirrored sunglasses. Today's private military contractors are, for the most part, highly trained professionals, veterans of elite units like the SAS, Green Berets, Spetsnaz, JIGN, or police tactical teams who have swapped national uniforms for corporate logos. Their motivations vary. Some join for six-figure paychecks, others for the adrenaline of staying in the game, and a few for ideological or even moral reasons, the belief that they can do it better than the bureaucratic militaries they left behind. Inside a PMC, life feels strangely hybrid. Part soldier, part entrepreneur, part ghost. The compound might look like a military base, with its sandbag perimeters, armored vehicles, and makeshift gyms. But there are no flags, no odes, no national anthems. Contracts, not constitutions, rule. The rhythm of life is dictated by risk assessments, convoy schedules, and the next client's request. In Iraq in the early 2000s, it wasn't unusual to find former Navy SEALs, South African Recce veterans, and Eastern European commandos sitting side by side in a prefab canteen, trading war stories while eating reheated MREs. Anecdotally, some ex-US special operators walked away from government pay and structure to join PMCs, drawn by the promise of better money, fewer restrictions, and illusion of personal freedom. But the reality was more complex. Without the institutional safety net of a nation-state, they operated in a legal gray zone, armed, visible, but officially invisible. The disparity between contractors and regular military forces could be palpable. Soldiers saluted a flag. Contractors answered to a client. The military had rank and accountability. PMCs had NDAs and liability clauses. In joint operations, soldiers might resent contractors' higher pay and better gear, while contractors quietly envied the soldiers' legitimacy and camaraderie. On the ground, the work was intense and disorienting. Teams moved between green zones and red zones, escorting convoys, securing compounds, protecting diplomats, or training local forces. The tempo could swing from weeks of boredom, endless perimeter checks, maintenance, and waiting for intel, to seconds of chaos when a roadside bomb or sniper shattered the illusion of control. The stress came not only from combat, but from ambiguity. Who are we fighting for? What are we defending? In a traditional army, purpose is handed down through doctrine and duty. In a PMC, it's written in clauses and fine print. Morale management was a quiet art. Without a unifying ideology or clear mission, cohesion depended on professionalism, trust, and shared danger. Alcohol, dark humor, and gym workouts became pressure valves. The bonds between contractors were often tight but transactional, as temporary as the contracts themselves. When one rotation ended, a team could scatter across continents, one man to a new job in Afghanistan, another back home to teach executive security, another to vanish into civilian life. Operational reports and later testimonies reveal a psychological toll. Contractors faced not only enemy fire but moral ambiguity. Mistakes, misidentifications, and civilian casualties carried not only human consequences but corporate liabilities. Every trigger pull could mean both survival and breach of contract. When conflicts wound down, many contractors followed the natural war-to-business cycle, shifting into consulting, security advising, risk management, or private training. Others founded their own firms, turning battlefield experience into boardroom credibility. For some, the transition back to normal life proved harder than any deployment. Civilian society had little space for those who had lived in the shadow world between soldier and salesman. Inside a PMC, war is both a profession and a product. The men who fight it learn to see themselves not as warriors of nations, but as specialists in a privatized trade, where danger has a price tag, loyalty has a contract number, and every mission ends with an invoice. One of the most compelling fractures in PMC discourse is the legal and normative gap. Consider the 1989 International Convention against the recruitment, use, financing, and training of mercenaries. Its definition of mercenary is narrow, so narrow that most modern firms don't fit. The convention has few signatories and little enforcement. By contrast, the Montreux Document 2008 and ICRC guidance articulate how international humanitarian law, IHL, and human rights law apply to PMSCs, and they present good practices for states. But these are non-binding. They do not create prosecutions or automatic liability. Instead, they shift the burden back to states to enforce compliance within their contracting frameworks. The core legal concept at play include attribution. Is a PMC act legally attributable to contracting state? Contracting state liability. If a state uses a contractor to commit abuses, can it be held accountable? And the narrow definition of mercenary. Most contractors are not mercenaries under Geneva Convention frameworks. This legal opacity is not accidental. Kim Svensson calls the efforts to establish binding regulations Sisyphean, observing that UN and Human Rights Council efforts on PMCs consistently stall due to opposition from states that benefit from strategic flexibility. Meanwhile, states relying on PMCs often lack the incentive to prosecute or restrict them. As McFate reminds us, one cannot morally legitimize mercenary behavior simply by having a state as a paying client. In short, law remains a shadowy boundary, something PMCs navigate in gray zones, sometimes lightly, sometimes with impunity. The paradox of power is this. The state which condemns private guns often contract them in secret. In modern conflicts, private military companies become instruments of plausible deniability, strategic flexibility, and operational reach. Behind every deployment lies a political calculus. How much violence can be outsourced without losing control? In Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. government leaned heavily on contractors to fill gaps in manpower, intelligence, logistics, and security. At the height of the war, over 250,000 contractors worked alongside regular troops. The logic was simple. Contractors could be hired, reassigned, paid, and dismissed without votes in Congress or media scrutiny. Some estimates show that up to 70% of the U.S. war effort in Afghanistan in 2010 was supported by contractors in non-combat roles. But for some states, the attraction goes deeper. Authoritarian regimes and revisionist powers like Russia or Saudi Arabia can use PMCs as force multipliers without the embarrassment of uniform deaths. When public opinion turns hostile, the death toll belongs to the contractor, not the government. That is precisely what happened with the Wagner Group in Syria, Libya, and Ukraine. From 2015 onward, Wagner forces aided Russian campaigns while the Kremlin maintained distance, until Wagner became too powerful to ignore. The infamous 2023 crash that killed Yevgeny Prigozhin and top leaders stunned observers, but many analysts see it as a clearing of a rival, not an end to the paradigm. Some governments use PMCs as strategic first responders, covert insertion teams, resource protection guards, or regime security detail that can vanish behind a smoke screen of deniability. Others seek to fragment conflict ownership, let private proxies fight insurgencies while official armies claim legitimacy. The result, state violence becomes modular, fragmented, and increasingly privatized. In the best cases, PMCs provide vital services, protecting diplomats, securing humanitarian convoys, training national forces, or guarding infrastructure where local militaries are overstretched or corrupt. In the worst cases, they operate like corporate mercenaries, profiting from instability, prolonging conflict, or taking advantage of weak governance to extract money, influence, or resources. And PMCs, like arms dealers, have a financial incentive for instability. A peaceful country doesn't need private soldiers. This creates moral hazards. The longer insecurity lasts, the more profitable it becomes. Some PMCs have been accused of manipulating threats, exaggerating risks, or supporting one side while negotiating with another. Even when unintentional, their presence could distort local security markets, crowding out national forces and making governments reliant on foreign contractors. Wagner is a case study from hell, the company that ate the system. What began as a private military firm gradually evolved into a quasi-state actor with global reach. Between 2014 and 2022, Wagner deployed in Syria, the Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, Mozambique, and Venezuela. It was not merely hired muscle. It negotiated mining concessions, manipulated elections, and enforced Russian policy objectives beyond Moscow's front line. Take Africa. In the Central African Republic, Wagner provided security to President Faustin Archange Touadéra while controlling mining operations in gold, diamonds, and uranium. That dual role of business and force transformed Wagner from mercenary to par-state actor. The company structure was opaque. Front companies, shell firms, consulting designations, and mercantile trading arms, mass combat deployments, and legal footprints. After Prigozhin's death in August 2023, many wonder whether Wagner's reign ended, but the paradigm is intact. Some Wagner-affiliated units have been absorbed into Russia's National Guard. Others remain in place across Africa, still under Russian influence. The consequences are clear. A PMC can outgrow its camouflage, becoming a competitor, a kingdom within a kingdom, and a danger to both host states and patron states alike. Consider the tilt in incentives. National armies are accountable to constitutions, parliaments, courts, and the public. Private companies are accountable to boards, balance sheets, and clients. When life and death become line items, what ensures moral restraint? Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have documented PMC-linked abuses, extrajudicial killings, torture, forced displacement. Yet prosecutions are rare. The Montreux document and ICRC guidelines affirm that PMSCs must comply with international humanitarian law, IHL, but enforcement requires wills, resources, and jurisdiction. Many states lack either. One famous example, the Nisour Square Massacre, 2007, when Blackwater contractors shot and killed 17 civilians in Baghdad. The U.S. later convicted some operatives, but immunity claims, appeals, and cumbersome judicial processes diluted the accountability. For many of the broader abuses in conflict zones, in Libya, Yemen, Sub-Saharan Africa, redress remains partial or absent. Philosophically, the outsourcing of force may create a moral outsourcing problem. When decisions about life and death are made by faceless corporate units, the human conscience is distanced. Accountability, in this world, must rely on deterrent regulation, transparency, legal frameworks, and civil society pressure. Yet in a global environment of weak enforcement, the result is often impunity. The battlefield tomorrow is already here. Private armies, drones, AI, cyberbots, algorithmic targeting. The merging of capital and force is accelerating faster than laws adapt. PMCs are investing in ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, drone swarms, battlefield analytics, and even autonomous platforms. Some firms provide forensic cyber intrusion, battlefield management software, and predictive targeting now. Consider autonomy. As weapon systems become more automated, the concept of meaningful human control emerges as a red line in debates among Geneva Convention adherents. If a PMSC launches lethal autonomous drones under AI control, who is legally responsible? The company, the developers, the client state? The chain of accountability is fractal and fragile. Eric Prince, the controversial founder of Blackwater, has repeatedly floated ventures to supply drone services, unmanned logistics, and security as a platform constructs. His ambition is to turn security into a subscription. The privatized architecture of force is now converging with Silicon Valley. Technological trajectories suggest future wars may look less like pitch battle and more like corporate algorithmic competition. Firms will compete in battlefield as a service. Data, targeting, kinetic modules, and logistics deployed over subscription contracts. The modern battlefield is unrecognizable from the trench lines of the past. In the end, the core question resurfaces. Who has the legitimacy to kill, wage war, or protect? If coercion is no longer exclusively a public function, what standards, oversight, and accountability can we place on private actors? One critical policy lever is home state regulation. Countries that license PMCs enforce criminal liability, audit contracts, and impose export controls. Without that, contractors can roam free globally. Another is mandatory transparency. Require public disclosure of contract terms, use of force reports, casualty logs, and chain of command structures. A third is international accountability, using universal jurisdiction and independent investigative mechanisms to prosecute abuses across borders. Civil society, media, and academia also play a role. Narrative pressure, documentation, war crimes adjudication, and naming and shaming may deter excesses when courts hesitate. Reports from think tanks like RAND, Chatham House, and CIPRI consistently recommend building norm subsystems for oversight, not utopian global regimes, but incremental standards that constrain worst abuses. The risk is real. If PMC proliferation continues unchecked, warfare becomes a privatized domain, subject to profit, speculation, and corporate interest. The human cost is unmeasured, and the accountability gap expands. When a state can wage war anonymously through proxies, what stops escalation? What stops fragmentation? What prevents conflict from becoming perpetual? In this new world, violence becomes a chassis meant for leasing, modular, rent-a-war, subject to business logic. But justice demands something else. Not just force, but responsibility. Not just contracts, but conscience.